What's new?
I'm Zev Elif, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and today I'm joined by Professor Jessica Cooperman, Associate Professor of Religion Studies and Director of the Jewish Studies Program at Muhlenberg College, the author of an incredibly important book, Making Judaism Safe for America, World War I and the Origins of Religious Pluralism. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here.
So historians have noted the importance of the Jewish Welfare Board for decades. But you were the first to really probe deeply into the archives and not produce a military history of Jews in World War I. Anybody who thinks that's what the book is should read the subtitle. What you demonstrate, however, is how the sight of the military and its importance during the Great War had a lasting impact on religious culture in the United States and religious pluralism. How did the Jewish Welfare Board emerge, and how did Judaism as a religion, how was it shaped by World War I?
Thanks. That's a great place to start. So the Jewish Welfare Board is founded very much in response to World War I. It's shaped by a lot of the key players in more established Jewish communal organizations, particularly the American Jewish Committee. And I think that it comes out of sort of two motivations. I think that some of those leaders who are involved in the American Jewish Committee, Cyrus Adler in particular, but also people like Jacob Schiff and Louis Marshall, are looking for avenues for directing the American Jewish community in ways that they feel are appropriate and advantageous. Particularly, it's 1917. There's all these rumblings and then eventually new pieces of legislation about immigrants. They are very concerned about Jewish assimilation into American society. So I think that in part, the Jewish Welfare Board comes out of those larger communal concerns that are brewing before the war starts. But as the war starts, they are very cognizant that the American government is going to use religiously based organizations to provide what were known as soldiers' welfare services to the largely men, some women, but mostly men in the American military. And they want to be sure that Jews have a seat at the table in the provision of those services. They want to protect Jewish soldiers from the influence of evangelizing organizations, particularly the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, which they know will be providing the bulk of these soldiers' welfare services. And so they want to make sure that there is a Jewish voice, a protection for Jewish servicemen, and that Judaism is represented in the American military. And so they found this organization, the Jewish Welfare Board, in order to do that, to represent their interests and to represent what they see as American Jewish interests in the American military.
And why, in the context of military, why was it received the way it was? Meaning that Jews wanted a seat at the table is obvious, or it's intuitive. But why was it successful in obtaining a footing?
I think that's really interesting because it was not obvious that they were going to be successful in this quest. In fact, the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, and Raymond Fosdick, who became the sort of head of this commission on training camp activities that would oversee the provision of these welfare services, certainly did not initially think about including Jews as part of this program. And in fact, they were pretty resistant to the idea of including Jews in the provision of welfare services, and were pretty explicit that they wanted this to be what they called a non-sectarian program that would not divide soldiers on the basis of religion. And to them, I think what non-sectarian meant was a kind of non-denominational Protestantism. And they were, I want to give them credit as to being well-intentioned, but kind of blind to their own biases in how they understood what non-sectarianism meant, and how minority religious populations would understand and would perceive the role of an overtly evangelizing organization like the 1917 YMCA in the military, right? The young men in the military are kind of a captive audience. These welfare services are going to be everything from boxing and movie nights to pastoral counseling and Bible study, right? And so the idea that a Protestant organization could provide services that would be acceptable to all Americans was an assumption that the government made, but was clearly not going to be acceptable to Jews or to Catholics. Catholics were not included under the umbrella of the YMCA. There were no Catholic YMCA representatives. And so Catholics also perceived this supposedly non-sectarian program as being very problematically sectarian. I think that Catholics and Jews were successful in gaining a seat at the table, not out of any kind of impulse towards religious pluralism on the part of the military or the War Department, but really as I think they kind of had their hand forced by the demographic realities of the United States in 1917. This was the most diverse military that the United States had seen up until this point. There were somewhere between maybe 200 to 250,000 Jewish men who eventually served in the American military. And there were estimates that they were expecting up to a third of the military to be Catholic. And so Catholic and Jewish groups were able to lobby for a place at the table, not because the government was looking to be more embracing of pluralism, but because they needed to be sure that those men were going to answer the draft and show up and serve, and that their families at home were going to be supportive of the war effort. So the Knights of Columbus, which is a Catholic fraternal organization, actually made the first sort of successful play for a seat at the table. And they were very explicit that our boys need their own welfare services. They need their own pastoral counseling. They need their own types of Bible study and recreational activities. And then once Catholics had a seat at the table, it became much harder to justify why you would keep Jews away. And so these leaders of the Jewish Welfare Board, who, as I said, were affiliated with other organizations who were pretty politically savvy, were able to both capitalize on the success of the Knights of Columbus, on these Catholic organizations, to gain a seat at the table. And several of the men involved in the founding of the Jewish Welfare Board were wealthy and influential people. And they were able to make strategic donations, to call in some favors, and to use their political connections and I think their political savvy to argue that if you're going to make space for Catholics, then you have to make space for Jews as well. And so they end up I think unintentionally pushing the military, intentionally on the part of the Jewish Welfare Board, unintentionally on the part of the War Department, pushing the government to embrace a much more pluralistic vision of American religious identity.
So the subtitle, The Origins of Religious Pluralism, it's incredibly compelling and provocative because many of us presume, and Kevin Schultz and others have spoken about and written about tri-faith America, this idea of American pluralism. Although Hutchinson would claim that it goes all the way back to the founding fathers, perhaps. But most of us had presumed, most of us, historians have presumed, that the dawn of religious pluralism was engineered by World War II. Mm-hmm. Think about the four chaplains who give up their life vests and plummet to their doom hand in hand as a sign of religious pluralism. They get a stamp, they get several movies, books. Other than their deaths, they did quite well. And that creates a new wave of what Schultz describes as tri-faith America. You and other work has shown that actually we can move up the dawn or a certain revival of religious pluralism to World War I.
Yeah, I would make that argument that it's important to think of World War One as this turning point in this American debate about pluralism. Certainly, we can find evidence of pluralism earlier, and I would agree with Schultz and with Deborah Dash Moore and other historians who have looked at the really important role that the military in World War II and the U.S. engagement in World War II plays. What I found really interesting about looking at the Jewish Welfare Board is thinking about the sort of structural changes that were necessary for that social change and cultural change to take place during World War II, right? So by the time you get to World War II and you have this, powerful story of the 4 chaplains who go down with the ship, well, how did you end up?
Which is tragic. I don't want to suggest
it is. I know it is. It's a powerful story. It really is, and tragic. They lose their lives, and whether it's a myth or not, right? That we have this. Well, actually, that idea of a myth really becomes interesting. I think in World War II, right, the government as a whole seizes upon the importance of the roles of its 2 Protestant chaplains, a Catholic and a Jewish chaplain, and they portray them, as you say, in memorial windows and stamps and films, right, as linking arms and praying and going down with the ship, and actively promote that vision of tri-faith American pluralism. And that active promotion of it, the way that there is popular and official backing of that story and spreading that story, I think we can trace to World War II. But how is it that we ended up with those chaplains on the ship? Right, that I think we have to look backwards to World War I, right? Because while we can look at the sort of origins of the Jewish military chaplaincy, for example, to the Civil War, when laws are changed to make it possible for rabbis to serve as chaplains in the U.S. military. In practice, there was no mechanism through which rabbis could be selected or appointed. Appointments to chaplain positions were generally made in accordance with the majority religious identity of the men in any given unit, right? Jews were never going to be the majority, right? So by what mechanism could you have a rabbi serving as a military chaplain? That was left really undefined until the work of the Jewish Welfare Board in World War I. The organization is founded and they lobby hard and eventually successfully for the creation of these positions for what was known as chaplains at large that would serve minority religious populations. They are able to secure the appointment of eventually 25 Jewish military chaplains who will be selected by the Jewish Welfare Board and then recommended on for commissions as chaplains. And they sort of institutionalize the policies by which you can take that kind of theoretical possibility of Jews serving as military chaplains. They create the mechanisms through which this can actually happen, both legally and in terms of the qualifications for rabbis, the training, the supplies that they will need, and also for the kind of support they'll need in military camps and bases, right? The chaplains don't operate totally independently. They have support staff all around them. So the Jewish Welfare Board creates these positions for field workers, right? Who are sometimes employed directly by the JWB to work in military camps and bases, but they make connections also with local rabbis for military camps that are located in the States. They'll make connections with a local rabbi to offer support to those soldiers. They put the infrastructure in place that allows there to be this sort of organizational and institutional support for things like a Jewish military chaplaincy, for things like the presence of Jewish religious services on military bases, for the presence of libraries that will have books of Jewish interests, people who can speak Yiddish to Yiddish-speaking soldiers, right? All of those sort of institutional structures are put in place through the work of the Jewish Welfare Board in World War I. And so when we look at that story of the 4 chaplains in World War II, I don't think we should in any way discredit how powerful that story was in changing American perceptions of religion. But I think we can't understand how that situation came to be without looking at these earlier institutional changes.
And it sounds to me that's not even just the mechanism, that's a piece of it, but it's also the agency and the refining. I'm talking about savvy politicking. But here you have an American culture and a Jewish infrastructure that now, after working, after the experience of World War I, is in better position over the next 2, 3, 4 decades of engineering that spirit.
I think that's true. I think that the men who led the JWB clearly wanted to push American society, the American government, the military, to think about a sort of tri-faith vision of the United States. The government, like I said, didn't go into it willingly. That wasn't the intention going in. But the War Department did stand by their decisions. Once they allowed Jews and Catholics a seat at the table, they were pretty conscious, at least in their public-facing material, of promoting a sort of harmonious union between, or cooperation between, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. There were sometimes behind-the-scenes wrangling that went on, but in terms of public-facing ceremonies and materials, they were pretty consistent about it. And I think that also makes a big difference in terms of shaping public consciousness, certainly shaping expectations within the military and within the War Department. The years after World War I are a little unsatisfying for the JWB, frankly. Without the backing of the military, without this obvious military role, really do lose their ability to claim a role in representing American Judaism to the American public. They become involved, deeply involved in the founding of the JCC movement, but they don't have that same sort of broader American public-facing role. And there's all kinds of kind of frustrated letters that they write about how difficult that is, although they remain involved certainly in veterans organizations and military organizations. But as the country gears up for World War II, the JWB, I think, probably spearheads, but certainly becomes deeply involved with the negotiation with the YMCA, with Catholic organizations to form a new group that will serve as that kind of pluralistic representative to the American military. And they become deeply involved in the founding of the USO, the United Service Organization, that takes on that role in World War II of providing a lot of the welfare services for soldiers, for servicemen in the American military. Not so much the chaplains' roles; those become institutionalized within the American military more broadly. Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and eventually will obviously become more diverse than that. But the JWB stays involved, maintains those connections, and is able to work with Protestant and Catholic partners to found this new organization that will continue to push a much more truly, I think, non-sectarian mission to providing soldiers' welfare services that embraces this kind of tri-faith ethos.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.